This is the fifth series of mobile communications and networks. In the other series, we've looked at the technology itself, the history of the technology. We've looked at applications of the technology. And this time we decided we would look at the impact of the technology on society. So what is it doing to shape our society, our societies? And we're very privileged this evening to have the first lecture in this series being given by Tom Standage. Tom is the digital editor of The Economist. He's had a number of previous appointments with The Economist as business affairs editor. I have a list of them here: technology editor, business editor, science correspondent, and he's also the author of several history books, of which one is a particularly a favourite of mine. That's the history of the Victorian internet. But this evening he's going to talk about something a little bit more modern, namely how mobile phones promote economic development. So can I welcome Tom and invite you to give your address. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you about one of my favourite subjects. And yes, one of my other favourite subjects is the history of telecommunications and the fact that the Victorians beat us all to it by 150 years. And you won't be surprised to hear that actually the Victorian internet will make a fleeting appearance in this talk, but only fleeting, because the main subject is about how mobile phones promote economic development. This is a subject I've been interested in for many years, and I've written about quite a bit. Here are two covers of The Economist that I've done on this subject. The first was in 2005, and that's it looks a bit blurry from over here. I don't know if you can see it there. That's a boy in Africa, and he's made a mobile phone out of mud, and he's holding it up. And then the other was more recent. That was in 2009, and that was a special report I did on pretty much this subject, actually, the impact of telecoms in the developing world and the potential for mobile money. And we'll come on to that in a bit. But essentially, the reason I'm so interested in this is that an approach we very often use at The Economist is we imagine we're a Martian, or we're on the moon, or we're floating up above the Earth, and we sort of look at the Earth and we say, if we're thinking about a particular subject, what would an alien who arrived on Earth and knew nothing about what was going on, what would they think was the most important thing? What are the biggest trends? What are the really important shifts, and so on? And we try and sort of step back from certainly the national concerns and the sort of parochial nature of the coverage that you get in a particular market, and in fact try and step back even from, say, being too Western-centric about things and try and take a global view. And I think it'd be fair to say we succeed in this some of the time, but at least we're trying to give a global perspective on things. And I think if you look at what's happened in the first 10 years of this century, and you say, well, what's the biggest technology story that has taken place in the first decade of the 21st century? I think in the West we'd be very inclined to say, well, it's all about the internet and the impact of the internet and things like smartphones and the iPhone and all that sort of thing. And yes, you can make that case. That has all been great. But if you look at the beginning of the decade, or in fact, if you look at most of the 20th century, in the West, we already had telecoms. We already had telegraphs, and then we had telephones, and then we had internet, even if it was dial-up. We had communications. And all we've really gained is sort of faster, more portable versions of them. Broadband is very nice, and the smartphones are great things, but essentially they are incremental, they're improvements. And if you look at the developing world, people have gone from not having any telecoms at all to having mobile phones, and that's a huge, huge leap. It's a much, much bigger step. So I think if you look at the past decade, the biggest change in technology, the biggest technology story, and that's really what I'm supposed to be looking for, find the big trends, has been the impact of mobile phones in the developing world in particular. And that's because, if you look at the numbers, that's where most of the phones are. Now, this chart's actually from 2009, and it goes up to the end of 2008. But essentially, if you look at the year 2000, the light blue is mobile phones in developed countries. And you can see that 3/4 of them are in developed countries. At that point, there's about 750 million phones in the world. and about 3/4 of them are in developed countries. By the end of 2008, there are 4 billion phones in the world, and 3/4 of them are in developing countries. So that's a massive, massive shift. And we're now actually, if you look at the latest numbers, we're now at 6 billion phones worldwide, and 1.5 billion are in the rich world, and 4.5 billion are in the developing world. So again, you've got this 3-to-1 ratio. So essentially, mobile phones are predominantly a developing world story. To an engineer's approximation, well, not quite. Most phones in the world are in the developing world. And I have to point out that this doesn't mean that 6 billion people have phones, because obviously that would mean an awful lot of people have phones. I don't know about you, but I've got 2 devices in my bag, and I've got all sorts of other things that have phones in them. So, and the same is actually true in the developing world. It's very, very common for people to have multiple SIMs that they put into phones so that they get the best deal and they can call friends on particular networks and that sort of thing. So 6 billion... 6 billion devices doesn't mean 6 billion people. So it sounds good. It sounds like it's 87% of the world population, but it's not. It's maybe 50 or 60, who knows. But anyway, it's still pretty amazing that we've gone from pretty much a standing start in 1990 to 6 billion now. India and China are both heading towards 1 billion each, and China will just get there first, probably in the next 10 days. But it will then be overtaken by India, probably within about 2 weeks. So that's quite funny. So lots more India-China rivalry there. But yes, 1 billion in each of those countries. Anyway, the spread of mobiles, the reason this matters, and the reason it's happened, is that mobile phones are amazing, amazing technology when it comes to promoting economic development. In fact, they're probably the single best technology for promoting economic development. Don't take my word for it. Those are the words of Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, a great guru of development. He calls mobile phones the single most transformative tool for development. So why is this? Why is it that a device just a few years ago, there in 2000, was basically a yuppie toy? Well, it was a yuppie toy in the sort of 80s and 90s, wasn't it? But it's now become the single most transformative tool for development. It's something that's within reach of a growing proportion of the world's population, even some of the world's poorest people. Those are the questions I'm going to try and answer for you today. So how were phones able to spread so fast? Well, I'm an engineer by training, so I would like the answer to be clever engineering, but unfortunately that's only part of the answer. It's quite an important part of the answer. One of the things that happened was that technical standards got sorted out, notably with the GSM standard in Europe. And in fact, this was pioneered by the Nordic countries, got together and being good socialists, they said we're going to try and make phones cheap and accessible to everyone. And so they came up with the idea of standards so that you could roam from one Nordic country to another. And that system was called NMT. And it showed you the benefits of having a standard, and it meant that Nokia and Ericsson emerged as champions. And when GSM showed up, even though it was a wider project than that, they did very well out of it. And then GSM went on to become basically a world standard with about 80% of the 2G market. So that was part of it, that having standards means that you can make phones on larger scale, and then the prices go down. And also, the miniaturization, Moore's law, that sort of thing helped as well. That meant that the price of a phone fell from $1,000 in the 90s down to $50 or so by the middle of the following decade. Another interesting aspect of this is the business model. And the business model that has really made the difference here is one that we're familiar with here, but they're actually not very familiar with in America, and that's prepaid billing. Prepaid originated in Europe so that teenagers could have phones. Because if you have a contract and you give your teenager, you're basically giving them a blank check, and that's a really bad idea. So prepaid was invented. It was first pioneered in Portugal, and it became very, very popular in Italy. And it became popular in Italy for tax reasons. There was a tax on the fixed part of the bill. So you had when you had a contract, you had a certain amount you paid for the line rental, even though there was no line because it was all wireless. So you paid something like a €5 tax on that, and then you paid for the calls on top. And what the operators realised was that if they did prepaid, not only did they get the money in advance, they got rid of the line rental and they could get rid of the tax, and they didn't have to pay any tax, and they could actually charge you more for the handset. The other for the service. The other story that people tell about the success, the very early success of prepaid in Italy, and it's one of these stories that we journalists call too good to check. The story is that it was popular because Italian men like to have one phone for the wife and one for the mistress, you see, and then that made it much cheaper, and there were no bills showing up to sort of incriminate them. So, draw your own conclusion. I wouldn't like to impugn an entire nation of... actually, how can I say that? The Economist's most popular cover last year was the one of Silvio Berlusconi, and the headline was, "The Man Who Screwed an Entire Country." We've got a bit of a long-running thing going with Berlusconi. Anyway, so you've now got, it's the mid to late 90s. You've got GSM sorted out. You've got this idea of prepaid billing. So you can afford to give even teenagers who can't be trusted phones, even though they don't have a credit rating and they don't have a bank account, no problem. They can just buy scratch cards and do it that way. And people start to try to apply these models in the developing world. So I spoke to the former head of MTN, which is one of the big African operators in South Africa, and he said that when they first launched mobile phones in South Africa, they said, well, mobile phones are very expensive, so these are things we're going to sort of only be able to sell to the rich, and we're going to have contracts and all that sort of thing. And they tried doing that, and no one would really, it was such a lot of money to buy the handset and take out the contract and commit yourself to so much per month and all this sort of thing. And then they said, hang on a minute, we could be doing this prepaid billing. So they started doing that. Now, initially, there is this big problem with prepaid billing, which is that you have to buy the whole handset. So if you're familiar with the way the industry works, you get free handsets from the operator. They're not really. When you sign up for your free iPhone for $16.50 a month for the next 2 years, £5 a month of that, or whatever, is for 2 years, is going to pay for the iPhone, or £10 a month, actually, in the case of an iPhone. So essentially, the operator is lending you the money, and you're paying, in effect, quite a high rate of interest to pay them back over the course of the 2 year. Now, that's a kind of modern system where you have a contract, you're kind of locked in. But with the basic prepaid approach, where you don't have any sort of commitment, you're just using scratch cards, you need to buy the handset up front because the operator doesn't know that you're ever going to make a call again and that they're going to make any money from you. So they need to eliminate that risk. So you need to find the money to buy the handset. But once you've paid for it, you're just then paying for the calls. And that's the prepaid model we've had in Europe. The problem with doing this in the developing world is that the relative proportion of your household income you need to find to buy that handset is much, much larger. So what we start to see in the developing world, and this happened in Bangladesh first, was the idea of the village phone and combining microcredit with mobile phones. And this was an idea pioneered by, among others, a good friend of mine called Iqbal Qadir. And he's Bangladeshi, and he went to university in America and worked on Wall Street. And one day all the computers crashed and the networks failed and he couldn't work. And he sat there thinking, And it reminded him of when he was a small boy and his sister had been ill and he'd had to walk for a whole day to get some medicine for her. And when he got to the place that had the medicine, the pharmacy, it was shut. And then he had to walk all the way back again. So it was a waste of a day. And he remembered thinking at the time, how great it would have been if I could have found out in advance. And there he was in New York, sitting in front of a computer that was no good because there was no communications either. And he'd heard about this idea of microcredit, which is where the original model for it is you've got an entrepreneur, usually a woman in a village, and she wants to set up a business and she needs a bit of help to get going. She wants to buy a sewing machine or she wants to buy a cow, are the two usual things. So let's stick with the cow. So you buy a cow, and let's say a cow costs, I have no idea what a cow costs. So it's like there's politicians not knowing what a pint of milk costs. I don't know what a cow costs. So let's say a cow costs $100. So you take out a loan, you buy the cow, and then you have to pay back the loan gradually. And of course, you've then got this asset that produces milk. So you sell milk in the village, and then you use some of the proceeds from the milk to pay back the loan. And after a year or 2 years or something like that, you've paid back the loan. You've now got a source of income from the cow, and people in your village have got access to fresh milk. So everyone wins. It's a great system. And this is how microcredit works. And the other part of the model is that your friends are all part of a group and they've all borrowed money to buy sewing machines or chickens or whatever. And essentially, there's peer pressure between those people not to default on the loan. So the repayment rate is extremely high. So what Iqbal Qadir realised, and it sounds crazy, but he was right. He said a mobile phone could be a cow. And what he meant was if you sold a handset to a woman in a village, and you have to actually attach a funny aerial to it because you usually do this in a rural area where there wasn't very good network coverage. But you essentially sell the phone to her, and it doesn't look like a normal phone. It looks like a yellow sort of payphone, sits on a desk, has this aerial, goes on the roof. She takes out a loan of, at the time it was about $200 for the handset and the aerial. And then she starts renting out the phone to people in the village. And then they start to do this with handsets as well. But essentially, if someone wants to use the phone, they come to her, they pay her, she lets them use the phone, and then part of the money that she takes goes to paying off the loan, and eventually she pays it back. And then if someone wants to call someone in the village, they ring up her phone, and then she goes, oh, hang on, I'll go and get them, and then she runs off and she gets it, says it's for you, and then they come. So putting one phone into a village puts the whole village onto the communications network, and people start to use it. And these were called the telephone ladies of Bangladesh, and this model was then applied in Cameroon, Indonesia, Rwanda, Uganda, and it sort of primed the pump because people got used to the idea of using phones. They could start to, if they needed to make an important call, how much will I get for my cow if I take it to market? How much will I get for my crops? That sort of thing. They got used to the idea of doing this. Now, the era of the telephone lady is over now, pretty much, because the handsets have become so much cheaper that people can afford to have their own. But it was a really important pump priming move. So those are three factors, and then the fourth factor has a chart associated with it, and that's deregulation. It's something we're very keen on at The Economist. Essentially, most countries had telecom monopolies. As soon as you introduce competition, prices go down. And if you don't believe me, look at this chart. This is from the ITU. Year zero in the middle there is the year where there's the entry of the second mobile operator. And those numbers are the mobile phone subscribers per 100 people. So if you look at the top line, that's actually Tunisia. So you can see that within 3 years, they've gone from about 7 or 8% penetration to about 57 or 58% penetration. And you get the same thing with all of those countries. You get an increase. It depends how many operators you have as well, because they all sort of compete more vigorously when you have more, and you get this sort of hyper competition in India, say. You don't get so much in Kenya, so Kenya's at the bottom there. In Kenya, the Vodafone affiliate, in fact, FREng, is very, very dominant, but that turns out to be a good thing for reasons we'll find out later. But they have about 70% of the market, so there hasn't been quite as much of a lift-off there. Although actually they're now up to 67% in Kenya, so it happens eventually. So this is absolutely crucial. What you do is you issue licenses, people show up and build networks, the price of telecoms goes down, penetration goes up, and the government hasn't had to do anything. All they've had to do is, in fact, they can make money doing this by selling the licenses. So regulation is crucial. And I think to show how important this is and how having the wrong kind of regulation can actually get in the way, the place to look is Ethiopia. Ethiopia is basically, as far as I can tell, the last telecoms monopoly. Actually, North Korea has a monopoly as well. But Ethiopia, at the end of 2008, Ethiopia had 3.5% mobile phone penetration. And at the same time, Somalia, a country that has no government, had 8% mobile phone penetration. And why was this? Well, it's because having bad regulation can actually be worse than having none at all. And what happened in Somalia was that lots of people set up networks for the hell of it, because you can sell access, people will use them, people want them. As Mo Ibrahim says, even warlords want their phones to work. So he launched networks in Sierra Leone, Congo, places like that. Horrible places to be, but everyone wants to be able to call their mum or call their fellow warlord or whatever it is. So in Ethiopia, you've got this situation where the government is saying, we know best, we're going to be the only operator. In Somalia, you've got lots of people setting up networks, and in fact, they all got together and formed a regulator because they needed to decide on things like spectrum allocation. So they spontaneously regulated themselves. Now, things have actually got much worse in Somalia, and things have got slightly better in Ethiopia. The way they give out the SIM cards in Ethiopia is they have a riot. So they go, there's going to be 6,000 new SIM cards tomorrow, let's have a riot. And then there's a riot because, 100,000 people show up and there's only 6,000 SIM cards. So, but gradually the number of SIM cards goes up and it gets a bit easier. And I think they're up to 12% in Ethiopia, penetration now, versus 50% for Africa as a whole and 67% in Kenya. This is ridiculous, and it's just because of the government's stupid policy. But wait, this month the government made an announcement. They got all the journalists together. They said, there's going to be an announcement from Ethio Telecom. Yay, this is it. Maybe they're going to change their minds. And they announced they had changed their logo. Never mind. So they have set a target, however, of 65% mobile penetration by 2015, but while retaining their monopoly. So deregulation is key. Deregulation leads to competition, leads to lower prices, leads to higher penetration. And even warlords want their phones to work. Mo Ibrahim, the guy who told me that, is a great man. He set up a company called Celtel in Africa. It ended up with networks in lots of different countries. He ended up selling it for $3 or $4 billion. He built $1 billion company in Africa without paying any bribes, and without relying on resource extraction. So he's not an oil or a mining company. He just built networks. He says this proves that Africa is open for business. I think that's very impressive. But the other really interesting point about this is if you look at the big African operators, well, that was the one that he set up. Look at the biggest Indian operator, Bharti. Look at the biggest Chinese operator, China Mobile. These are not Western multinationals. This is not Western firms going into the developing world and saying, hey, folks, we've got all the technology. Allow us to sell it to you. In fact, they all ran away in the 1990s, the few that tried. It was local companies that did this. And in fact, local knowledge is key, and understanding local markets is very important. But the great thing about this, these are big, big companies being created in developing countries, creating lots of jobs, and creating a new industry that boosts the economy in other ways. But how do I know that? How do we know that more phones leads to more economic development? Because it's possible that if you had more economic development, then people would be richer and then more of them could afford phones. So how do you know which way around the causality is? Well, for many years, there was just lots of anecdotal evidence. And if you think about it, it makes sense. So go back to Iqbal Qadir and his having to walk for a day to get medicine. If he'd had a phone, he could have called to find out that the pharmacy was going to be closed. So the basic thing that phones do is they substitute for poor or non-existent infrastructure. If you've got bad roads, you've got bad postal services, that sort of thing, then mobile phones can save you a lot of time. And there are also anecdotal stories about farmers and fishermen phoning around to see where they could get the best price for their produce. And so we were all sort of duly writing, oh yes, mobile phones are great because they save you wasted journeys, and you can call 3 markets and see where you're going to get the most for your crops or whatever. Mobile phones also unlock entrepreneurship. So you see porters, people whose job is just to carry stuff around for people in the developing world, and they're homeless, they sleep on the street, but they have mobile phones. And it's because that's how they get their work. They couldn't get work otherwise as easily because people can just ring them up and say, can you do this for me? And my favourite example actually comes from Iqbal Qadir. He talks about the story of a barber in Bangladesh. And he wanted to rent a shop, but he couldn't afford the rent. So instead he bought a motorbike and a mobile phone, and then he would drive straight to his customers, and it was more convenient for them, which meant that he could charge them more. Similarly, a carpenter who has a phone in their office has to come back to the phone to listen to the messages on the answering machine. If you've got a mobile phone, you can just be rung up wherever you are. So it unlocks entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurs, the word entrepreneur means a lot of things, I think, but basically people who work for themselves, and that's actually 50 to 60% of all businesses, of all people who work in the developing world, and it's apparently 90% in Africa, according to Jussi Impio, who is someone I spoke to about this at Nokia. Mobile phones make micro-entrepreneurs vastly more productive. A plumber no longer has to go, or a carpenter no longer has to go back to his shop, but also you can do all sorts of crazy stuff. You can be calling your suppliers while you're standing at your roadside stall, so you're not wasting that time. And in fact, Jussi gave me this example of an entrepreneur he'd found who had a roadside stall selling a rather interesting combination of products. He sold underwear and ice cream. And I don't know if you got a discount if they went together, but that was what he was doing. And basic things like stock handling and dealing with suppliers, he could just do standing on the street with his phone, so that was fine. So these are all anecdotes, and it all sounds plausible that this would drive economic development. Another thing that another reason we know that they do is that they create tax revenues for governments. So governments are able to fund things because they can raise money easily, because they can basically outsource tax collection to operators. If you think about it, operators have to have a billing system that works or they go bust. And so if they're then told to add a bit of tax onto everything and give it to the government, then the government only has to deal with the operator and doesn't have to bother doing tax collection. And quite a lot of developing countries do this. So Afghanistan, the biggest single source of tax revenue is from the mobile operators. And it also means, if you want to raise money quickly, the Turkish government introduced an emergency mobile phone tax after the Bam earthquake in 2001. And can you take a wild guess if they ever got rid of it? No, so Turkey has the highest proportion of mobile phone bills going on tax of any country, and it's about 50%. So it's a very, very easy way to raise money. But that said, the reason it's an easy way to raise money is because people are spending money on it. And why are they spending money on it? Because they perceive there to be value there. They're prepared to spend a much larger proportion of their household income on telecoms. And they wouldn't do that. They're not stupid. They wouldn't do that if they didn't think there was value there. So it's all plausible, but so far this is all anecdotal. So how can we actually quantify how mobile phones drive development. Well, thank goodness for Robert Jensen of Harvard University, who did a fantastic study in 2007. And it's to do with fishermen off the coast of Kerala. And what happened was there was no mobile phone coverage along the coast. But gradually, one of the operators started building it. And this made possible what economists call a natural experiment. Here's how it works. This is the coast. You've got Region 1, Region 2, and Region 3. And you can see, well, I can see, because I've got a high-resolution screen, the Region 1 at the bottom says that mobile phone coverage was extended into that circle at the bottom on January the 31st, 1997. And then in the middle of 1998, the coverage was extended to Region 2, and in the middle of 2000, coverage was extended to Region 3. So you've got a natural experiment where you can see what does the mobile phone coverage, the introduction of mobile coverage, do to economic activity in those areas. And in particular, what they went and mined, the Harvard researchers, was they mined the receipts to do with the sale of sardines on the coastal market. So imagine you are a fisherman, you're off the coast of Kerala, you've got your unusually good catch of sardines and you want to know where to sell it. You've got enough diesel to get you back to the shore and you need to figure out which market to go to. Now, if you haven't got a phone, you'll just choose a market, you'll drive to it, you'll sail to it. If you visit the wrong choice, you can't visit another market because the fuel's too expensive and each market's only open for a couple of hours before dawn. So you're then doomed. You can't sell your fish and you end up throwing them away. They just get dumped into the sea. So there's a dead loss there. So this was the situation before the mobile phones came in. And this is far from ideal, both for the customers of the fishermen and for the fishermen themselves. So in practice, what the fishermen chose to do was they would stick to their home markets all the time. They'd just always go back to the same markets because they had no way of finding out what price they'd get at other markets. They'd have no way of knowing how many other boats might be at those markets. So on average, 5 to 8% of the total catch was wasted. And he looked at 15 markets along this coast. So if we take the example of January the 14th, 1997, which is before coverage reached Region 1 here, 11 fishermen at one beach ended up throwing away their catches, and yet on that day there were 27 buyers at markets within 15 kilometres who would have bought them. So the lack of communication leads to this loss of destruction of value in the form of fish. There are also wide variations in the price of sardines up and down the coast, because if you've got scarcity at one market, the price will go up, and if you've got oversupply, the price will go down. So what you can then do is you can look at the level of wastage and the variation in price along the coast as the mobile phone coverage is introduced. And that's what Mr. Jensen and his researchers did between 1997 and 2001. And if you look at the results, it looks like this. So you've got wiggly, wiggly, wiggly chaos, which is the price fluctuations. And then in each case, you've got a line with an arrow next to it, which is where the phones came in. And you can see the price very quickly stabilises. You get a little bit of variation, but essentially it goes from utter chaos to stabilisation. And you can see this for each of the 3 regions very, very clearly. So there's absolutely no doubt what's causing this. The introduction of the phones is causing the price to stabilise. So that's great. What actually happened is that the proportion of fishermen who were prepared to venture away from their usual home market went from about 0 to 35% as soon as the mobile phone coverage came in any particular region. So they were calling different markets, finding out what was going on. That eliminated waste, essentially brought it down to 0. It reduced the variation in prices. This is what economists call the law of one price. So in an efficient market, a given thing should cost the same everywhere. That wasn't happening here, and then suddenly it was because it became a more efficient market. The fishermen's own profits went up by 8%. Consumer prices, on average, went down by 4%. The mobile phones paid for themselves, on average, within 2 months. And the network operators got paid. So everyone is happy. And this is the really, really solid evidence that links the anecdotal evidence for why mobile phones are a good thing and promote development to the macroeconomic studies, which had shown that when you have more phones, you seem to get more economic growth. So let's have a look at some of those. A bunch of people have done this study. Essentially, they look at they do cross-country comparisons and they across time and between countries, and they say, when you add phones, how much more economic development do you get? So the crucial thing, I don't know how well you could read that, but the crucial thing is the second set of bars, and the dark bars are the developing countries and the lighter ones are the developed countries. But essentially, the mobile phone in the developing countries is giving you an extra 0.8% an extra 0.8 percentage points of GDP growth per 10 percentage point increase in telecoms penetration. So what that means is if you go from 30 phones for every 100 people to 40 phones out of every 100 people, you would go from, say, 5% economic growth to 5.8% economic growth. That's how big the impact is. Now, the interesting thing about this chart is you can see the top one is fixed line phones, so you get a benefit with fixed line phones. But fixed line phones are really expensive to put in because you have to run around with bits of wire. Then the bottom two are the internet. So the very bottom one is broadband internet, and the one above that is dial-up internet. And again, that means running around, and until recently at least, it meant putting in wires and fibre and all that sort of thing. The thing about mobile phones is you can cover a large area very quickly. You put in the base stations, you use microwave to link them to each other, essentially, to do the backhaul. You use diesel generators, so you don't need any infrastructure locally. That's why you can set up a mobile phone network in the middle of a war zone, and it will actually work. So you can set up mobile phone networks much more easily than you can set up any of these other kinds of networks. So even though they don't give you the biggest boost, they are it's the lever that's easiest to pull. They're the one that makes the biggest difference. The other thing that's very striking here is that the developed country impact is smaller than the developing country impact in each case. And again, that's not surprising. It's because we already had telecoms of some kind in developed countries, and we have higher penetration levels to start with. So incremental devices make less of a difference. As someone at MTN once put it to me, he said, for you it was incremental, but here it's revolutionary. And that's exactly right. So a bunch of these studies had been done, which seemed to show that there was an increase in GDP associated with higher penetration of telecoms. So the problem was we weren't sure which way around the causality was. And studies like the Jensen study show us what's happening. It really is the case, at the microeconomic level, that mobile phones drive economic growth. Now, what that means is when we get to internet access in the developing world, that is going to have a big, big impact. And the way that's going to be delivered is through smartphones and Android tablets. The first $100 Android 1 gigahertz chip phones are just about to come out. Those things, combined with 3G and 4G networks, are going to deliver the internet to the developing world. In effect, it's not going to be through PCs, dial-up access. It's going to be through portable devices, I suspect. So that is going to have a huge impact in the future. Now, that said, to benefit from broadband internet to its full extent, you do need basic things like literacy, which you don't necessarily need to use a phone if you're a fisherman. So although that's one area where I expect there to be a further sort of developmental boost from mobile devices, it's not the one I'd look at right away. The one I'm more excited about in the near term is mobile money. Here the poster child is this, which is M-Pesa in Kenya. And it basically lets you send and receive money by phone. What initially happened was that people were using airtime as a quasi-currency. So I top up my phone with a certain amount of credit, and then I need to pay somebody some money, or I owe somebody some money, or I want to pay a bribe. Actually, this used to happen as well. The easiest way to do it would be to send the airtime, because what they often allowed, these phones, was that there's a little menu, and you could send airtime to someone else. So the airtime became a quasi-currency. And this showed people that there was a potential for paying for things through phones, because it was just sort of invented. People did this spontaneously. And in fact, it was a couple of Brits who did this with a grant from DFID, and they came up. Initially, their plan was that you would use the phone to pay back your microcredit loan. So going back to the cows and the sewing machines, you'd pay back your initial $100 loan using a mobile payment system. So you would go to your corner shop in the village where you live. You would give them $2 in the local currency. They would then apply that to the account on your phone and put the money in the till, and then you would be able to send that money from your phone to another account on another phone, in this case, the person who'd lent you the money. And they'd then say, thank you very much, and your balance is now this. So that was the original plan. But then they decided that actually this was just going to be much more useful as a person-to-person money transfer system. And that's essentially how it works. It turns every single corner shop that sells scratch cards into potentially a banking outlet. And this really took off in Kenya. It's now used by 70% of the adult population there. There are 15 million people using it in a country with a population of 40 million. And it handles 25% of Kenya's GMP. And in fact, it transfers more within Kenya each month than Western Union transfers globally, which is about $24 million a day. So in all, there are 28,000 corner shops across Kenya who will let you do this. You can cash in and cash out. So when someone sends you money, even if you're not actually on this network, you get a text saying, so-and-so has sent you this money. So you go to a corner shop and say, look, I've got this, and they type in a code, and then they go, here you go, and they give you the money. So it's brilliant because you can send money directly. There are 28,000 corner shops where you can do this, compared with 850 banks in Kenya. So banks are just irrelevant. Everyone is just going to do this. And they are. They're using it for savings as well, even though there's no interest. If you use informal savings, which is the development jargon for putting money under the mattress, buying gold or buying cattle, you typically lose about 20% a year of your investment. So if you put money into M-Pesa, even though you haven't got interest, it's still worth doing because it's just going to sit there. So that's one obvious example of why mobile money transfers could themselves drive economic growth. But there are others as well. Going back to the compensating for poor infrastructure, the way you send money, if you're a young man and you move to the city in order to earn money and send it back to your family, the way you used to send it back was every month you'd get on the bus and bring it back, or you would give the money to the bus driver and hope that he would actually hand it over. Now you can just send it directly. You can send it using your phone. And that means you're not taking the time to travel backwards and forwards. Now, actually, one of the studies has found that this means that people aren't seeing their sons and their husbands as much as they'd like to. But it means that they're able to continue working productively instead of taking time travelling. Another good example is paying school fees. I was in Uganda in 2009. And there were queues of people outside all the banks, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And it was because it was the first day of the month, and the school fees were due. And so everyone queues up, and it takes all day to process all the payments for all the people paying their school fees. With this, you just, because they've introduced mobile money in Uganda now as well, you can just make the payment straight from your phone. So there are all sorts of ways you can see that this makes the economy more efficient. You can move money around more quickly. In fact, this is what economists call the velocity of money, and it's gone up 3 or 4 times in Kenya, and it's actually starting to affect the rate of inflation in the country because this is so widely used. So I think there's enormous potential for mobile money to drive the next wave of development. We're seeing this in Kenya. Lots of people are now trying to replicate that system in other countries. The Philippines uses it, but mostly for transfers from people abroad. There's some of it in South Africa, but mostly by wealthier users. And I think the most exciting places to watch are Uganda and Tanzania. In Tanzania, it's Vodacom again, and they are introducing, so they're the sister company of Safaricom, who did this in Kenya, and they're up to about 2 There seem to be, well, I've got the number here, 2 million users they're up to now. Uganda is up to 2.3 million users. And what's interesting about the Ugandan example is that MTN, which is in about 15 countries in Africa, is essentially using Uganda as its test bed. And once it's got it all working there, it's rolling it out to other countries. So potentially, MTN can scale this model into lots of developing countries. And there's growing interest in this. There's a certain amount of it in Latin America. In India, it's all been held up by a big regulatory fight, but that's what happens in India. But eventually they'll get past that. So I think mobile money is the next thing to watch. Another possible thing to watch is data services. So you can get things like mobile phone-based agricultural advice, pricing information, language tuition. I saw a service in Uganda called Farmer's Friend, where you say, I've got this white spots on my tomato leaves. What do I do? And it says, oh, that's... And then after a little while, you get a message back. And it's either an automated reply, or if they don't know how to send you an automated reply, it's a human. And they say, oh, yes, that's this kind of pest. And they tell you how to make a pesticide out of household ingredients. So it's plausible that this sort of thing could improve economic development. But the trouble is we're back in anecdote world here. We don't have the solid evidence that we do in the nature of the Jensen study for the benefits of this, whereas we do for the basic introduction of phones. So we know that makes a difference. So this is a price chart that shows you things falling in price. So the bar underneath of each pair is the 2010 price, and the bar on top is the 2008 price. So prices are falling, and you can see that this is as a proportion of GNI, so it's as a proportion of sort of individual income. You can see that the bottom bars, which are right down here, those are developing countries. The ones above are developed countries. You can see that the proportion of the household income spent on telecommunications in the developed world is now about 3%. And it's been pretty flat for a long time. Although there are all these whizzy new services that we can we can get TV on our phones and all this sort of stuff. We're not actually spending any more on telecoms. In developing countries, it's much higher. It's getting on for 20% of household income. And some people look at that and go, it's a rip-off and all the operators should cut their prices. But I think what that actually tells you is that people are prepared to spend money on this because they perceive there to be a benefit. This really does pay for itself, which tells you that there's an economic advantage. And then you can see these are the countries where the price of telecoms fell the fastest between 2008 and 2010, and they're all developing world countries, which is great, and down by 80% in Azerbaijan. Yes, and down by 50% in Uganda. So there's scope for prices to fall further, but they are falling. Competition is doing its job where it's allowed to. There are some problems in some countries where tax regimes get in the way, and this is an Ethiopian thing. Ethiopia looks at the market and says we've only got 12% mobile penetration, and the people who have phones are generally quite wealthy. So therefore, mobile phones are a luxury good, and we should tax them because it's a way of taxing the rich. And this is a completely self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tax mobile phones, then only rich people will be able to afford them. Whereas if you just deregulate, then their prices fall and more people can afford them. And in the long run, you make more revenue as a government from your smaller taxes. So there is still scope, particularly in Ethiopia, for further deregulation. Another thing I think I should say is that telecoms obviously can't do everything. One of the things I saw was a clinic where people had been coming into the clinic. This was in Uganda as well. People had been coming into the clinic because there had been a campaign, a mobile health campaign, to tell people about HIV and other diseases as well, and encourage them to get tested. The problem was, although the campaign worked very well and the kind of outreach through telecoms worked very well, the clinics simply didn't have the capacity to support the testing. So it's the problem is you can't do everything over a wireless connection, and you can get a bit sort of carried away by this sort of thing and thinking, well, this is great and we can fix everything with phones. You can't. You can compensate for bad infrastructure, and you can make up for failings in other areas with phones. But ultimately, you can only compensate to a certain extent with some things. So essentially, you do need to deliver the infrastructure in other areas. And we're seeing India is running up against the limits of its poor infrastructure at the moment. What makes me really optimistic about all of this, though, is that the operators in the developing countries themselves have proved to be amazingly innovative at finding ways to make phones more affordable. And in fact, the ground zero for this is India. The Indian model, the Bharti Ericsson model, so it was cooked up by Bharti, now the biggest operator in India, and Ericsson. They came up with this model, which is essentially outsource everything. So Bharti said, we really don't want to get into the business of having to build and run networks because we don't know anything about that because we're new to this business. So you do that, Ericsson, and then IBM, you over there, you do all the IT and all the billing, and we'll just go out and do the branding and the retail side of things. And that worked incredibly well. Part of the reason is that Ericsson allowed them to buy not just coverage in an area, but capacity. So Bharti could go into a rural area and say, well, it doesn't really make economic sense to build a network here because we won't get enough subscribers for 5 years. And Ericsson would say, well, okay, we'll pretend that we'll basically give you the capacity as you need it, and you only pay for the capacity you use. So we'll pretend that we're sort of fading in the network. Now, of course, they actually have to build the whole network to start with. But from Ericsson's point of view, they get a customer for 5 years. From Bharti's point of view, they're only paying for as much of the capacity as they need. Again, brilliant, because it allows you to get into markets you otherwise wouldn't be able to get into. Another thing that came from India was tower sharing. So putting up a mast with with antennae on it and so forth. You have to get the site, and if every network operator is doing this, they are all fighting over the same sites, and it's a waste of time for all of them. So what they realised in India was that if they had companies that just did towers, and then they rented out the towers to everyone, that was much more efficient. And in fact, what the operators did was they spun off their towers and put them together. Now, this was something that people thought about doing in Europe about 10 years ago. And the problem was the regulators looked at it and said, we don't like the look of this, because if the operators are cooperating with each other on this, they might start colluding on pricing and things like that. But the Indian example shows you that that doesn't happen. What happened is that absolutely vicious competitors would be killing each other in the marketplace when it came to fighting for customers, but they would still at the same time be cooperating very happily, thank you, on where they were going to put their towers and so forth. So it showed that this didn't necessarily diminish competition, and that model was then in fact brought into Europe by Vodafone. So this was when Arun Sarin was the CEO, and he's Indian by origin, and he went to India to buy a local affiliate there and add it to Vodafone's empire. And while there, the Vodafone people learned all sorts of things. And one of the things they learned was that you can share towers and share networks with your rivals. So they then implemented that very model in Europe, doing network sharing with Telefonica. And then they've also borrowed another brilliant idea from India. It turned out that, you know how mobile phones, you have the antenna and everything, you have the base station at the bottom which has all the circuitry in it. Well, it all gets very hot, and so you need to have an air conditioner. And particularly for 3G in the early days, because it was very, lots of processing going on there. Well, it turned out in India, no one was bothering with the air conditioning, even though it's a hot country. Meanwhile, in Sweden, everyone was putting in the air conditioning, even though it's a cold country. And so the Swedish engineers said to the Indians, hang on a minute, isn't everything overheating? And the engineers said, no, it's all fine, we've been running it for years. And anyway, we'll replace it in another 2 years, so who cares what happens to it? If it doesn't last for 10 years, they're not going to be here in 10 years. So the Swedes all immediately went back to Europe and turned off all the air conditioners. So this is the kind of thing that we see, this reverse flow of innovation, that the developing countries are figuring this stuff out, and they're really showing the way in how you make telecoms more efficient and more affordable. Bharti ended up buying the Celtel network I told you about earlier on. Mo Ibrahim built this network in multiple countries in Africa. He sold it to a Middle Eastern operator called Zain. And Middle Eastern operators are really not cut out to compete in Africa. Middle Eastern operators generally have a monopoly, and they generally have quite wealthy customers, and so they're really not very good at competing. Whereas African operators, it's all about competition. So Zain, despite having expanded into Africa by buying Celtel, didn't make a very good fist of it and said, actually, you know what, this isn't for us. So they sold to Bharti, who are the best people in the world they could possibly have sold to, because Bharti is now taking the Indian model to Africa. And it'd be really interesting to see how that works. I'm talking to some people from Bharti Africa tomorrow, in fact. But the first thing they did was outsource everything, which is the Indian model. So it'd be really interesting to see how they can make that work in Africa and make the price go even lower. But the Africans are coming up with innovations as well. So Celtel had something called a seamless network. It didn't charge you roaming. Anywhere you were, in any of its countries, it was just all one network. And that reduced their costs because they didn't have to cope with billing and roaming and working out which country you were in. It was all just one network as far as they were concerned. And it was much more convenient for customers as well. And that is one example of an African innovation. Another one was MTN in Africa. They noticed that during the day people are making calls, and there are peak times, and at about 2 o'clock in the morning, no one's using the network. It's got 0.5% load. It's just sitting there and no one's using it. So they introduced this system of dynamic pricing. And what you get on your screen when you sign up for it is you get a number that tells you what the discount rate is. So during the day, it'll say 10%, 20%, depending on the network load. 2 o'clock in the morning, it goes up to 95%. And you're going, right, I can make almost free calls. So you start making calls. So it completely shifts. And people start doing things like saying, oh, yes, I'll call you. But then they start using the network in the middle of the night because it's cheaper. Now, that's great because they're making calls at a time of day when the network would otherwise not have been used. And sure, the operator is charging much less for it. But isn't that a brilliant model? We'd never have thought of that in Europe. Well, maybe we would have done, but no, it was all about sweat the assets here. Anyway, so that model is another brilliant example of African innovation. So the centre of mass of the whole industry is clearly in the developing world. It's where the subscribers are. It's where the innovation is. It's where the growth still remains because we've all got more than one phone in the rich world already. So it's the crucible of business model innovation in mobile telecoms and in mobile payments as well. You can pay for your cab with your phone in Nairobi, and you can't do it in New York. Well, you sort of can, because Google has made a phone that has a chip in it, and if you have one of those phones, and you're on the right network, which is Sprint, and you're with the right bank, which is Citibank, and you have the right kind of credit card with Citibank, which is a MasterCard with something or another in it, then you can tell the phone about that kind of card, and then you can use that to pay for your cab ride in some cabs. Now, when you intersect that many Venn circles on a Venn diagram, you get down to about 15 people, I reckon, and I think I suspect they all work for Google. So, but we're hearing quite a lot about trying to bring mobile payments to the rich world, but actually the developing world's way, way ahead of us. So it's great. Okay, well, I promised we'd touch on the Victorian internet. This is actually the first telegraph system. This is the Sachs telegraph. So it's before Victoria, but this is where it all began. If you step back at this, so going back to our sort of economist perspective, you're an alien, you're on the moon. It's 1791. You go, oh, look, someone in France has just invented telecoms. And that's what this is. So you point the arms around and you make different shapes and they make different letters. And you show this to people, and at first they go, it's black magic and riot, and then they go, actually, this is really clever. And then Napoleon goes, right, we're going to network the whole country. And that's what happened. And so the French were pioneers here. Of course, it meant that when the electric telegraph came along, they didn't want to get rid of their old system because they'd invested in it. It was rather like what happened with Minitel and the internet, because the French had put in Minitel, and it was great, and everyone was using it. And then the internet showed up, and everyone said, oh, we want to go on using Minitel. So they were late to the internet, just as they were late to electric telegraphs, because they were pioneers of sort of embryonic versions of the technology. Anyway, you're on the moon. It's 1791. You've spotted that telecoms has been invented in France. And other countries, Britain, Sweden, start to copy it. Then the electric telegraph shows up. Gradually, the number of people on the telecoms network in the world goes from 0 in 1791. And it starts to go up and starts to go up. And we're now at, what do you think, 4.5, 5 billion, something like that. So the project to connect the whole of humanity to a telecoms network began in the 1790s, and it will definitely be completed in the next decade. I mean, the rate at which things are going, we're basically finishing the job. So that is the sort of big picture of what's happening with telecoms in the developing world. Everyone will end up on the telecommunications network with all the benefits of being able to find out information and essentially drive economic growth that comes from that. So we are going to be witnesses to the completion of this amazing transition, which I think is great. So to go back to my original quotation, Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, and he said, mobile phones are the single most transformative tool for development. And here's another one, Mohammed Yunus of Grameen. He says, when you get a mobile phone, it's almost like having a card to get out of poverty in a couple of years. So I hope I've been successful in explaining why. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Now, Tom has agreed that he will take questions, so we've now got about 30 minutes where we can pose some questions and explore the ideas that Tom's presented in more detail if we wish. Now, could I ask everybody, when you want to ask a question, to take the microphone, because this is all being recorded. It's absolutely essential you speak into the microphone. So even if you have a very loud voice, please do take the microphone. And could you please announce your name and affiliation when you pose your question. And I think we had the first question from a gentleman in the row along
there. Derek Gregory, retired from the Medical Research Council. I, like most of us, if not everybody here, have enjoyed your talk and can well understand the benefits of business and making money. However, if I might challenge you, are you not taking away the very character of the developing countries by giving them mobile phones? They live by using their, shall we say, intuitive character in the way they live. In addition, young people are forever looking at their mobile phones. And I think of the times before mobile phones when people turned their brains on and were able to assess using their intuition and their senses. Finally, I would say that in the event of a tragedy, say a plane crashing and some people are still alive, or a boat sinking, or a train crashing and the mobile phone has been destroyed, you will have to use all your senses to get from A to B to survive. And if you haven't got a mobile phone and you haven't been taught how to survive, for example, via the scouts and the guides and organisations like that, then you're in limbo, I'm afraid.
Fair enough.
Leave it at that.
Right. Well, I hope you said that you had enjoyed my talk, but you may have said you endured it. So I'm going to assume you said enjoyed. I think this I don't think your question is really about the developing world at all, because the same complaint is made about people with mobile phones in the rich world. So I think we can just park the idea that people in the developing world ought to sort of live in a different way from us. There's no reason why they should be poor and we should be rich. And if they want to do whatever they want to do, they should be allowed to do it. No one has put a gun to anyone's head and said, you must buy a mobile phone. This is something people want. This is why they have riots in Ethiopia. People understand that this is a way to better themselves and lift themselves out of poverty. So they are choosing to do this. They are rational actors. At the same time, then, we have this question of, aren't we losing something when we have mobile phones everywhere? And all I'd say to that is, well, with every new technology, society has to adjust and figure out new rules. So we're currently working out whether, for example, it's permissible to use mobile phones at the dinner table. Is it permissible to use them on planes? What are the rules about using them on trains? And we've had this with all previous technologies. In 1909, Telephony magazine reported a scandalised aunt who was outraged that her niece had answered the phone to a man she didn't know without being properly dressed. This is the kind of thing that always happens with new technologies. In 1864, a group of enterprising dentists sent an urgent telegram to every member of Parliament advertising their services. Now, at that time, getting an urgent telegram in the evening meant one of two things. The Queen had died or war was being declared. So all of these people whipped open the telegram. My God, what's happened? Why have I received a telegram now to be told that Messrs. So-and-so and so-and-so were open for business between these hours and could be found on Baker Street? And they were outraged and went to the Times, which dutifully printed the telegram in full. And this was the first example of spam in history. And it worked brilliantly. So with every single technology, there is this, oh, well, if only we could go back to the way things were before. And I'm afraid that's just, we've had it, you get this moral panics. So novels, they were very bad indeed because they gave women the idea they might be able to think for themselves. People were very worried about that in the 18th century. Also, novels were introduced about the same time as sofas. And this meant that people sat around going off into another dream world when they should have been paying attention to what was going on right under their noses. And they weren't. Let's see, what are the other examples? Rock and roll turns you into a Satanist. Comic books make you into a drug dealer. Video games turn you into a cop-killing, homicidal maniac. This is all obviously rubbish. But when there's a new technology, people superimpose their fears onto it. And we should just recognise that for the pattern that it is. And some people never get used to it, but ultimately the young grow up and the old die out, and then we move on to the next technology. Finally, on the Scouts, I would just say that my daughter is a scout, or a guide, actually, and this is not in any way incompatible with her having a mobile phone or playing video games. So I think that's a false dichotomy.
Thank you. The lady there, Hayden.
Hi, Alton Stillen from the Royal Academy of Engineering. Thank you for an excellent talk. You twice quoted Jeffrey Sachs there, talking about the transformative power of mobile phones in the context of poverty and development. But the only time you mentioned any organisation that was in the business of international development or aid was when you said that DFID had made a sort of contribution to the development of M-Pesa. And I just wondered whether there are any sort of wider conclusions that you thought we might draw from that.
Well, you could say that the NGOs played rather a marginal role in this, and that the people who made the big difference were the entrepreneurs in the developing countries who set up the operators, people like Mo Ibrahim. So he didn't do this out of charity. He did it to make a business, and a very successful business it was too. Similarly, Bharti have brought telecoms to hundreds of millions of people in India, and they're doing it because they're driven by the profit motive. So I think the idea that improving the lot of people in the developing world is something we in the West have to do through NGOs is, let's say, not the whole story. Gentleman? Which I suspect you agree with.
Gentleman there.
Hello, Tom. It's John Lowe from the Sir Henry Royce Memorial Foundation. We're associated with Rolls-Royce and high-quality engineering, and our mission is helping this Royal Academy of Engineering and area sub-bodies to encourage young people into science, technology, and wealth making. So this question is about education for young people and about business. Fascinated that you pointed out that many of the business development ideas are coming in the reverse direction to expectations. And there's been comments about young people. I'm well aware that Bill Gates a little while ago commented and complained that too many people are learning to use Microsoft Office but not being capable of developing the software. Recognizing your sort of broader economic view how can you help bodies like Sir Henry Royce and the Royal Academy of Engineering get young people to understand the enterprise and the engineering that's necessary? What can we do practically to get them to embrace STEM with mobile technology and electronics, where we're clearly falling a little short today on a global scale, UK versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, Bill Gates is a very interesting character in this whole story, because the first slide I showed about the digital divide, the digital divide rhetoric was dreamed up by the American computer industry to make a problem out of the fact that people in the developing world weren't buying its products. So they made it into a problem that, there was this terrible... there's no PlayStation divide or washing machine divide, but they came up with this, oh no, they haven't got computers and they need to have them. And the person who said this was a load of rubbish first and earliest and loudest was Bill Gates, who you'd be surprised at. But the reason was that he was stepping down from Microsoft, and he wanted to work out what to do with his money. And he's a very smart guy, Bill Gates. And so he went and worked out where he could make the biggest difference for the smallest expenditure. So how could he make the biggest difference? And it didn't take him long to work out that vaccination was the single big... Save a life for 40 cents. That's, pretty good bang for the buck. And that's why he has put so much of his efforts into health and into agricultural development and things like that, because he says you get to all of this writing software and having PCs stuff later, provided you've got those building blocks in place. And you can't jump straight to the broadband and the so forth if you haven't got basic healthcare and literacy and the other things you need. So Bill Gates is actually very good, and that's a very characteristic thing of him to say, to complain that people know how to use his product and they don't know how to program. I have to say, I see among my daughter's generation, she's 11, and I've heard this, but again, it's only anecdotal. I have heard, I see straws in the wind suggesting that young people are more interested in this than they were 10 years ago. That things like smartphones, you can write a smartphone app. There are teenagers writing smartphone apps. The software frameworks you need make a lot of this much easier. Things like Arduino and open source and the maker movement and 3D printers and just technical Lego, to be honest. There are all sorts of ways that you can play with this that don't necessarily involve lathes and the sort of old and soldering irons, the old-fashioned ways of doing it. But you can still play with this stuff. And what I see is a growing interest among people, because smartphones are cool and technology is cool, and they want to know how to do it. My daughter can't decide whether she wants to be an archaeologist or a video game designer, and she may be able to make those two work together in some way. I don't know, but she wants to basically, what she loves about video games is the technology, but also the mythology, and she wants to sort of combine the myth making and the ancient Greek stuff with the technology. But they are very interested in this stuff, and so I'm not sure, beyond just reminding people that it's engineering that makes all of that cool stuff possible, I don't know how you can kind of formalise that anymore. But I think the kind of thing I'm doing as a journalist is I'm trying to explain how technology works and explain the impact it has on society. The social impact of technology is my big thing, and I hope that a byproduct of that is that people understand, you have this terrible anti-scientism happening in America at the moment, and yet, if you don't believe that the Earth goes around the sun, then why does your mobile phone work? There is this sort of loss of, and this is terribly frustrating for the scientists in America. But in particular, the sort of let's see if we can outdo each other and how ignorant we are when it comes to science among the Republican candidates is extremely depressing. I think the best thing we can do is to remind people, explain how things work, so education, but also explain not just how things work, but how they connect to changes in society, and how it is that the things that we like doing, the technologies we find cool, work under the hood, and how you can tinker with them yourself. And it's getting easier to do that tinkering. That's the great thing. So I know it's unusual to be optimistic about it, and maybe it's just because I'm not looking at the same depressing statistics that you are. But anecdotally, I'm quite happy about this.
There's a gentleman there.
Hello, it's Peter Briley from London Underground. I saw on one of your graphs that there was a big rise in the number of mobile phones in Tunisia. Do you think that there's a relationship between mobile phones and democratic development?
Yes, but again, the evidence is anecdotal. So I don't know how you would try and quantify that one. But again, there are lots of really nice anecdotes of things you can do. So one of the things you can do, for example, is if there's an election going on in a dodgy country, you can call the radio station when a particular polling station declares a result, and then the radio broadcasts it, and then it's much harder to retrospectively change that result. So that's something that's, using mobile phones for election monitoring has become quite widespread in Africa in exactly that way. So that's the sort of thing you can do. But also, yes, more broadly, there's a very nice example from Kenya, which is where discussion of the extent of corruption in Kenya is very difficult, but mobile phones allowed it to happen because people would call into radio stations anonymously and they would tell stories about corrupt officials, and there was no way they could be found out. There was no way they could be traced because it was an anonymous call to a radio station. So it enabled that discussion to be held and those things to be aired. So it's part of the sort of greater transparency you get with communications. And then, there are things like the organisations of protests in the Philippines using SMS. That's the kind of classic example. And more recently, the role of social media in the Arab Spring. But I think the way to understand that is, my favourite term for it is as an accelerant. So you can't start a fire with an accelerant, but if there's a spark and there's already a fire burning, you can make it grow, you can make it burn and spread faster. And I think that's what telecoms and media and communications technology do. The underlying reason for the Arab Spring is, high food prices, high levels of unemployment, dissatisfaction with corrupt governments, and so on. You need to have an actual reason to have a revolution. But if you're then actually going to have one, then having communications technology around makes it a lot easier. And Tunisia is a relatively, for the North African coast, is a relatively wealthy country, so you'd expect there to be quite high mobile phone penetration. So the two are, they're congruent, but I wouldn't sort of say one simply causes the other. And what I'd love is for someone to do the Robert Jensen style study. It's just that measuring things like how democratic a country is quite hard. The EIU, our sister organisation, tries to do it, but it's quite a lot of sort of hands in the air, fingers in the air going on. So.
The next is the gentleman to the right of our first questioner.
Yes, Charles Cerner from King's College London. If you're going to use a mobile phone, you've got to have a power supply. Is that going to limit this fantastic growth that you've shown us?
No, because once again, necessity is the mother of invention. So you have to work out all these great low-cost ways of doing things in developing countries because you have no choice. People aren't going to subscribe if the service is too expensive. And the way they handle charging is you go to the market and there's someone there with a car battery, and while you're doing other things at the market, you leave your phone with him and he charges it for you, and then you come back. And so then that's created, that guy's job is that he sells electricity. And then he goes to his friend who plugs it in or wherever he gets it, who knows where he gets it from. But that person's job is to sell charging to people. You're also starting to get solar charging. That's starting to become more feasible, particularly in very sunny countries. And the power efficiency of the phones is going down. And there's some really interesting work being done by, I think it's Intel researchers at the University of Washington. But Nokia is looking at this as well, which is how much power can you scavenge off things like TV radiation. And can you scavenge power from things, so ambient radiation, they can get, I can't remember what the exact figures are now, it's about a 30th or a 50th of what you need to charge a phone. But essentially that's going up, and the energy you need to actually run a phone is coming down. So you combine that with a bit of heat scavenging as well, because you can do that, and then a bit of solar. Then you can, I think we'll get to the, in 10 years' time, I'd be quite surprised if we're plugging our phones in to charge them. I think they'll just charge ambiently by stealing energy from the environment. So ultimately, that guy who's selling you power from a car battery is going to be out of a job. But I'd like to think he's moved on to something a bit better by 2023. So.
Gentleman there, then Sir William, and then Alec Rose.
Ralph Benjamin, Bristol University and UCL. A comment rather than a question. In 1982, I retired from the public service and took a job as head of communication techniques for NATO. And I immediately judged that with the beginnings of fiber transmission and the emerging concept of cellular technology, the military could no longer ignore what was happening in the civil world. they still would need dedicated networks or ad hoc improvised local area networks, but there was a significant scope for civil technology in implementing these, and the transit networks could and should use the civil communications infrastructure as far as possible. The reuse of frequencies in cellular networks meant a huge increase in capacity. The wider variety of routing alternatives available implied much greater resilience. The fact that military communications were sort of masked in a large mass of civil communications meant that interception, analysis of deployment patterns, monitoring of the traffic flow pattern within the system would be much more difficult in improving security. And of course, using civil technology within the local area networks and civil investment in the transit network would improve economy. But I added to this that I thought by far the biggest impact of the new technologies would be in countries where some combination of low population density, difficult terrain, possibly political instability, lack of funding meant they had little or no then existing telephone network, because they would straight away jump 2 or 3 technology generations to all personal mobile communications.
Which is just what happened, yeah.
With a huge impact, I then said, on lifestyles, on society, and on economy.
Hurrah.
Now, after 30 years looking back, I think qualitatively I was right on.
Yep.
Quantitatively, I didn't quite appreciate how huge this huge impact was going to be.
Yes. Well, we usually tend to overestimate the short term and then underestimate the long term, don't we? But I think this whole idea of military using civilian technology, I mean, it's definitely going by leaps and bounds now, because we have the story of the $50,000 screwdriver and other crazy sort of military procurement. My favourite example is that the drone aircraft, in the small hand-thrown ones that they use in Afghanistan to just do over-the-horizon reconnaissance, they're controlled by people using Xbox 360 controllers. And then another of my favourite examples is the sniper rifle calculator. So this is a computer that fits onto the side of a sniper rifle, and it calculates the trajectory for you, taking into account the distance to the target, the wind, and all this sort of thing. Now, 20 years ago, that would have been a dedicated computer. It would have cost $100,000. It would have had all sorts of buttons on it. Now it's an iPod Touch with an app, and I don't know if it's called iSnipe or whatever, but that's clearly, when you can get a computer that does everything like that for $99 or whatever the basic iPod Touch costs, then you might, you'd be daft not to use it. So I think this reverse flow from not just civil, but it's consumer technology flowing into business and flowing into medical and flowing into military technology. Mark Andreessen, formerly of Netscape, calls this reversal of polarity in the industry. Because it used to be the case that GPS and computers were things that were military, and then they trickled down into big companies, and then eventually, 20 years later, consumers got them. But now the consumer market is so big exactly because of this, because there are billions of consumers in the developing world who you can sell mobile phones or iPads or iPod Touches or whatever to. The scale economies you get mean that you can produce them much, much more cheaply than you could, and then everyone else, whether it's the military or the hospitals or the big companies, gets to benefit from them.
My name is William. Excuse me. My name is William Barlow. I'm the past president of this academy, and I was founder director of Vodafone, and I was chairman of Ericsson UK the 10 years the networks were set up in this country. So I've followed the progress of mobile telephony ever since then. Tonight you opened my eyes to the impact, to the economics of these African countries. It was a scale I had no idea. But I look at the title of your lecture, How Mobile Phones Promote Economic Development. Can you please tell me how mobile phones are going to promote the economic development of Britain in its present state?
I don't think they are, I'm afraid. I mean, the problem is, as I said right at the beginning, we had phones already, and then the mobile phone is just a phone you can carry around and play Angry Birds on. So that's negative as far as economic productivity is concerned, because everyone's playing Angry Birds. So short of banning Angry Birds, I mean, that would probably make a big impact right there. But I'm afraid I don't see there isn't this sort of quick win available from increasing the penetration, because we're already north of 100% penetration with these devices. So if they are going to do something, it's going to have to be because we can create more companies like ARM. I mean, all of these devices are powered by chips designed in Britain, which is great. And we need more companies like ARM, like Rolls-Royce, like Glaxo, that are heavy on the R&D happening here, and the manufacturing. It doesn't really matter where that happens. So that's our best chance of benefiting from this. Gaming is actually quite a good one, because Britain punches above its weight in video gaming. We have a long tradition of it, and the smartphone platforms have brought back the one or two man game development shops. But I don't see that, unfortunately, as being able to provide a very big economic boost on its own. So ultimately, it's a long-term game, creating more world leaders like ARM.
I'm Alec Brosner, another past president of this academy, and also a 10-year board member of Vodafone. Now,
they're everywhere.
We're everywhere. I really appreciate your combination of social science and technology and economics. And my question is there somehow maybe the secret of how the UK could recover, as Bill is suggesting? We're very good at finance. You made those remarks about using the phone as money. Now, of course, we've talked about that for years and years. I mean, it was even one of Chris Gent's tricks to say, look, this is going to be your wallet. It hasn't been. So with your sharp sort of perception, which I think we all appreciate, what would it take in the Western world, or what is it that's gone wrong in the Western world that stopped this happening?
Very good question. Essentially, the problem was we already had banks, we already had ATMs, we already had a system that worked. In Africa, they didn't have that, so M-Pesa was fulfilling a need, which was it was taking you all day to get on the bus, go to the bank, pay the school fees, come back again. So part of the problem was that we already had a system that was quite good, and the additional benefit of mobile money transfer isn't big enough to be worth the cost of doing it. That was one of the problems. The next problem was that the operators, Chris Gent among them, said, this is ours, we're going to do this, we own the customer, we are going to make Vodafone money or whatever. And the bank said, oh no, you're not, we're going to do it. And Nokia said, oh God, what are we going to do? Tell you what, guys, we'll make phones that have two SIMs in them, one for the bank and one for the operator. Well, of course, that went nowhere. So that's been the problem, that the operators and the banks have really they've both. Well, okay. So, but look at what happens in other industries where this happens. What we really need, unfortunately, Steve Jobs died. But what has happened many, many times is that Apple has taken a half-baked idea. Whether it's, smartphones you could download apps on. They were around 10 years ago. You could download, I had a Nokia phone you could download Java games onto. Music players were around before the iPod. Computers with windows and icons and mice were around before the Mac. Tablet computers were around before the iPad. What Apple's done time and time again is it has said, here is a technology that's a great idea, but it's a bit crap, and this is how you do it, folks. And then everyone else goes, oh, of course, and then they all copy Apple. And what I'm hoping is that Apple is going to do that this year with mobile payments. And the reason they're in a very good position to do it is that when you have an iPhone, you have to sign up for iTunes or you can't buy any apps or any music. So they've got 250 million people who they know the credit card numbers of, and they're already connected to their bank accounts. So imagine if they made a money transfer system between all iOS devices. They could do it overnight. They could create a critical mass. And then you could... you'd essentially have to do deals, but they could shift the logjam here. That said, there are other people doing this. Vodafone has announced a deal today with Visa, which you've probably seen about. The US operators have formed a consortium called ISIS, where they're all trying to get together and do this. So there's Barclays has got what's it called? Ping, I think it's called, a money transfer system. So people are trying to do this, but I think it needs somebody to really come and sort of give the whole system a big kick, probably from absolutely outside the system. And that's what Apple did with music, because the record companies all hated each other's guts, so they were never going to agree on a single standard that any of them invented. So Apple came along and said, we've got our own standard, it's none of yours, so none of you wins and none of you loses. Why don't you give it a try? That's what we need. We need somebody outside the industry, I think, to come and do this. And my money's on Apple.
Tom, Dr. Barry Patterson, engineer and psychologist. What would your views be if we could have a complete mobile coverage on the London Underground?
I think that's great, and I don't understand what the case against it is. People say terrorism. And I have to say, I'm not quite sure I follow that one, because when kidnappers ring up and go, we've got the ambassador, hand over the money, people go, God, this would never have happened without the telephone. So it's the same. And in the case of mobile phones and bombs on trains, which is the thing that everyone's thinking about Madrid, right? So the Madrid bombs were set off with mobile phones. Oh, dear. So terrorists could, plant a bomb on the underground, and then they could ring it up and it would blow up. The thing is, the way the Madrid bombs were set off was they used the alarm clock function on a very low-end Nokia handset. Do you see people saying we should ban alarm clocks? You do not. And so this tells you that the problem is not the technology. The problem is that people worry about these things in an irrational way. There are always going to be bad people who do bad things with stuff. What you have to do is you have to say, what are the good things that good people will do, and will they outweigh the bad things that bad people will do? And by and large, they will. And certainly in the case of telecoms, they do. So I say, let's get coverage on the underground as fast as we can. And in Tokyo, it works brilliantly. That said, in Tokyo, there is a very strict etiquette that you never talk on your phone. So everyone's sitting there, they're playing and they're reading books, and they've all had 3G phones since 2001. But part of the reason it works is that no one ever talks. So I don't know how that would work in the West, and we'd have to. I don't know. We're still in the process of working out the etiquette there.
Hello, it's John Yeomans of Shared Band. At the weekend, I was at Romeo and Juliet, and I'm just reminded that had Romeo had that mobile phone and the message got through, it wouldn't have been a tragedy, of course.
I know. It's a nightmare if you're a screenwriter, seriously, because most modern plots, they don't work with phone. You've got to have the woman in jeopardy film, or the first thing she's got to do is lose her phone, or she's got to go, oh, no coverage, or oh, no, the battery's dead, and then the murderer can show up. It's a total nightmare if you're a screenwriter.
My question was actually on social networking as an emerging technology that's achieved an economic scale that doesn't yet rival mobile, but is actually pretty big. Just to what degree do you see this as just a small player in the 10-year time frame alongside mobile, and to what degree you actually see it as a game changer, whether it be in terms of democratising? I mean, will the Montagues actually talk to the Capulets via their mobile phones?
Well, if you look at Facebook, which is the Facebook accounts, social networking is the single most popular activity online. It overtook pornography actually quite a long time ago, 2007. It's now 1 minute in 7 spent online in the world is on social media sites. And of that in the world, Facebook alone is 1 minute in 6 in the whole world. Was it? Yeah, that's right. Sorry, it's 1 minute in 5 for social media as a whole, and Facebook is 1 minute in 7. So it's an amazing amount of. I worked it out once. It's something like 300,000 years of people time a month is spent on Facebook. So it is absolutely huge, and I think it's a big deal. The thing that hasn't happened yet is Facebook is going to be mostly a mobile company by the end of this year. So most of the people accessing it are going to be doing it on mobile devices. That's their own figure. The thing that hasn't really happened yet is we haven't seen location really be attached to social information. And we haven't really seen location attached to the internet yet. And I think that's a sort of open question. Who will do it? I think that the social networks are in the best position to do it. But if you think about what you can do when you combine those two sets of information so that you can overlay social information or recommendations from your friends or socially filtered information onto the world using a mobile device. At the moment, it means holding it up, but 10 years from now, it's glasses, and after that, it's contact lenses. The moment the contact lenses are a bit crap, they only have a 8-pixel screen, so you can't really do anything with them, but it's going to get better. And Google has these goggles coming out. Obviously, when Apple launches them, they'll have to be called eyeglasses. It's just, how can they must have patented that one or trademarked that one already. But being able to look at a room and see all the people you know where they are in that room, or be able to look at a city and see where your friends are, or being able to see be reminded who people are, what their latest tweet is, what their job title is. I mean, that's just the kind of tedious business application of it. The combination of those two things is going to be huge, and I don't know who will drive that. Will it be the social networks? Will it be the device makers? Will it be both of them? Facebook's probably going to launch a phone this year. So They could do it. Apple doesn't have a social network. Will they buy Twitter? I don't know. Google's trying to do both of these things. So I think that's a big shift that's coming, and that's exactly the right question to ask.
Hi, my name is Colin Carroll, and I work for Takeda Pharmaceuticals. You mentioned in your talk the use of mobile phone to deliver a healthcare message in developing countries. I was wondering if you could expand on that, if there's any other examples you could give of the use of mobile technology in helping to deliver healthcare, specifically maybe field diagnostics or so on, and maybe comment on the future of that technology as well.
There's a lot going on there. It's one of these things that's never quite taken off. So a lot of big tech firms have a health or an M-health division, and they hope that it will turn into a business. It never quite does. I think... Diabetes? Well, no, there's a bunch of examples. I mean, probably the simplest and most effective is the South African pioneered system, where you use text messages to remind people to take their HIV drugs, and you get much, much better compliance if you just remind them by text message. And so there's that sort of thing you can do. Yes, you can do remote diagnostics. You can use microscopes attached to phones to look at samples. You could do that sort of thing. So there is some scope there. I think the really interesting thing actually is in the rich world, because we've got a big problem with rampant runaway healthcare costs here. And how are we going to deal with it? And there's this movement of people called self-trackers. And they're using wireless devices to measure their activity, their pulse rate, their heart rate, and all this sort of thing. And some of the devices are getting quite clever now. They can measure stress levels and so forth. And the assumption is that you can keep people, living at home longer if you've got a good system of monitoring their health, and they don't need to sort of traipse backwards and forwards to hospitals and clinics the whole time, or go into a home. So I can see the possibility that what these geeks, the self-trackers, are doing now, because they then pool all the information and they work out what their sleep patterns are, and they work out where. I mean, there are people doing this with inhalers that have a GPS on them, and you can work out where the asthmatic hotspots in a city are and what they might be caused by. And so you can do these very large-scale trials by gathering data through mobile devices, and that's potentially very interesting indeed. But ultimately, we might end up in a world where your health insurance premiums go down if you wear a device that monitors how much exercise you're doing and other things. And at the end of each month, you go to a dashboard and it says, well, you could have really done a bit more exercise and you've put on a bit of weight, and so forth. And your premiums going up. Now, this sounds crazy, but this is already happening in car insurance. So there are devices you fit onto cars, and if you're prepared to have the device fitted onto your car, which measures how fast you drive and how far you drive and where you park it and how dodgy the neighbourhood you park it in is, and what time of day you drive and how busy the roads are, and then you get a lower premium. So I suspect that we'll see more in the developing world along the lines of the sort of rather low-tech solutions. Oh, another good example is M-pedigree. So that's cutting down on fake pharmaceuticals because you have a scratch-off code. There's lots of really cool developing world innovation happening there. But I think there's quite a lot of scope for this to happen in the rich world too.
So the last question from...
Dan Davis, retired, and another past president, I'm afraid. We're not all past presidents here.
There's a whole room of them.
A former chief science advisor, MOD, and I've never worked for Vodafone.
Right, okay.
However, when we look at various journals, including The Economist, we learn about the way that phones are going in more and more exotic applications which will tell us where the exotic restaurants are, where number 23 bus is, and yet we're getting the fact that 90% of these things are going to be sold in the developing world. Is this going the right direction? What should the applications be there?
Well, they want to know when the bus is going to arrive as well, I think. I mean, the idea that, oh no, they're all poor and they just want, like, farmers helping applications, I mean, they don't... That's just the way things are. People around the world want the same things. If you go to an internet cafe in the developing world, what are people looking up? They're looking up stuff about footballers and film stars. I mean, people are people. So I'm not sure that... I'm not sure that we need a different load of apps for people in the developing world.
Much cheaper phones, though.
Well, they're getting pretty cheap. I mean, the $100 Android phone is pretty impressive. That's a computer in your pocket right there. So that problem is, well, I wouldn't say it's completely solved, but you can get handsets from China for $11 or $12 now. Basic handsets that do text and SMS, and that's That's kind of, there aren't many people in the world who can't afford those, and obviously they can't do apps and all that sort of thing. But you're then on the ladder, so that price of the entry level phone has come way, way down, and it's getting to they're not quite disposable and give them away, but they're pretty close. I mean, that's 2 coffees in the developing world. Sorry, in the developed world.
Thank you. So I must draw the evening to a close now. I'm sorry about that. Can we thank Tom again for a splendid talk and for really a very stimulating conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.